Hey biology students! All right, here's our last video on plants. So this video is on the angiosperms. So what are the unique traits of the angiosperms? Well, two very important adaptations of the angiosperms: flowers and fruit. So what does it mean to be an angiosperm? Angiosperms produce flowers. Flowers produce pollen as well as the egg cells. So flowers are very colorful, usually with an aroma that attracts insects. And that's because insects act as pollinators. The fruits are produced inside of the flower. And why do fruits, why are many fruits fleshy or sweet? Well, that's to attract animals that aid in seed dispersal. How do they do that? Well, this animal will eat the entire fruit. In the fruit are the seeds. The seeds will not be digested in the animal's digestive tract, so the seeds will be pooped out somewhere. And it's a way to spread the seeds of the plant to other places where it wouldn't normally travel by wind. Okay, so pollen dispersal is by wind or animal pollinators. And of course, angiosperms are sporophyte dominant. Okay, remember this familiar diagram. Last time we built on this diagram for the gymnosperm lecture. We talked about how the unique adaptation of gymnosperms is the production of the seed. What's the function of the seed? That's right, the seed protects the embryo. So angiosperms also produce seeds, but the unique trait that the angiosperms have is to protect the seeds inside of a fruit. And all angiosperms produce a fruit of some form. So a lot of times when we think about fruits, we think about fleshy fruits. We think about sweet fruits, like this apple I have here for my snack. That is one type of fruit. Sometimes fruits, though, are hard fruits like nuts, or they may function in flotation like coconuts. So coconuts help to float and prevent the seeds from sinking. Or it could be like dandelion fruits. So if you recall dandelions from a kid where you would blow the seeds and disperse those seeds, well, those are actually dandelion fruits. And a lot of times little burrs, little rigid or spiky burrs that are produced by plants, angiosperms, are also considered to be fruits. So not all fruits are necessarily delicious. Pollen. That is a unique trait of gymnosperms as well as angiosperms. But the difference with angiosperms is that the pollen will be produced by flowers. Okay, let's talk about flowers. So flowers are part of the sporophyte of the angiosperm. And flowers contain both the male and the female reproductive parts. that will generate both the male and the female gametophytes and the male and female gamete cells. So let's start by looking at the center of the flower. This region here, I'm going to circle it in red. This region here, this is the female reproductive structure, and it's referred to as carpel. And the carpel so female reproductive structure. And the carpel is composed of 3 parts. Here at the top, we have the sticky part at the top. You see it's in yellow. That part is called the stigma. Then we have this tube, and that tube is called the style. And then we have this bottom part here. You see that right here? This part is called the ovary. And inside the ovary, we have ovules. And those ovules produce the eggs. So those are the 3 parts of the carpel. The male parts of the flower, there are usually multiple parts, okay, multiple identical male parts of the flower, where there's only one central area that is one central structure that is the female carpel. There are multiple male structures. So the male structures we see in this picture, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 identical male reproductive structures. I circled one of them in blue. This structure is called a stamen. The stamen is composed of the top of it here in yellow. That part is called the anther. And the anther produces pollen. And then this stalk here, this is called the filament. So it is possible for flowers to self-fertilize. So it's possible for the pollen from this flower to be released. Now that pollen can travel by wind, or it can travel by insects like bees, or even some birds like hummingbirds. So it is possible for flowers to self-fertilize. In other words, this pollen might blow over here and land on the stigma. Now the stigma is usually very sticky. Think sticky stigma. It's sticky and attaches to the pollen. And then that pollen will produce a pollen tube that will travel, allow the sperm, because remember, pollen is the male gametophyte, and the male gametophyte makes the male gamete, which is the sperm, and then allows the sperm to travel to the ovule sac where the egg is located, and we can get fertilization. So that is possible, although that wouldn't increase genetic diversity of this flower. So it relies on bees or hummingbirds as the primary pollinators in order to transfer the pollen to another location, to another flower. Okay, now I'm going to show you the entire reproductive cycle of the angiosperms. By the way, angiosperms are the most abundant plants on Earth, making up about 80% of all plants. Why is that? Well, they were very successful in the early days of their evolution, and they continue to be the most successful plants on Earth because they have all the adaptations, don't they? Roots, they have vascular tissue, they have pollen, they have seeds, they have flowers, and they have fruits. They've got it all. They've got it all going for them. And that has certainly aided their success in nature. Okay, so this is the diagram that you have in your PowerPoint. I highly recommend that you follow along and fill it in as we go. I also recommend that if you need to pause the video or rewatch a portion of the video, that you do so and take advantage of that ability that you can only do with a distance learning format like this. Like usual, I'm going to show you it by stages. So we take it in small steps. Okay, so this is the life cycle of an angiosperm. It happens to actually be a cherry tree. And of course, this cherry tree grows from a seed. And here we see the sporophyte growing out of the cherry seed, and it grows into the mature sporophyte, which we refer to as just the tree, okay? So remember, sporophyte dominant, it's going to be the largest structure. Sporophyte. Okay, what about the flower? Also sporophyte. But as we just learned, the sporophyte flower contains both male and female reproductive parts that facilitate the production of the male and female gametophytes, which are very small, very reduced, microscopic. You need a microscope to see the male and the female gametophytes of both gymnosperms and angiosperms. Let's start with the production of pollen. So recall that occurs in the structure of the flower we call the stamen, in the anther. So in the anther, we have all of these pollen sacs, and what's happening in there? Meiosis. So we say there is a microspore mother cell in each pollen sac, and it undergoes meiosis to produce microspores. That is the same term we used with the gymnosperms. Okay, so we get microspores as a result of meiosis. We get 4 of them. And then each microspore will divide by mitosis to produce pollen. Okay, the actual pollen. All right, now let's look at the female. Remember, female structure of the flower is called the carpel, but the structure that creates the gametophyte is called the ovary. So we're zooming in on the ovary here. And in the ovary, there's a megaspore mother cell that undergoes meiosis. And that creates 4 of these megaspores. However, 3 of them degenerate, which means they die off. So we only end up with 1 left, megaspore here. By the way, we are now haploid, haploid, haploid. All right, the megaspore undergoes 3 mitotic divisions. That means as a result of 3 mitotic divisions, there ends up with 8 cells. And they're all packaged in this little area here we call the female gametophyte, which is also known as the ovule sac, which is haploid. Let's also label it the female gametophyte. And let's remember that the pollen is the male gametophyte. Okay, so the ovule sac, also sometimes just referred to as the ovule, has actually, out of those uh, eight nuclei that we see in here, there's only one egg cell. So this is the egg cell at the bottom, and I'll circle it. There's the egg. There's another important cell here that has two nuclei in it. It's called the central cell. And that's going to be really important to the unique process of fertilization that occurs with the angiosperms. Okay, so let's label the pollination process. Okay, so the pollination process involves the pollen transferring to the stigma of the female part of the flower. And then a pollen tube forms that transfers the sperm to the egg. However, in that process, two sperm nuclei are transmitted. As a result, we end up with what is referred to as double fertilization. Those two sperm, one will fertilize the egg and form the zygote, the diploid zygote. The other sperm will fertilize the endosperm, or the central cell. And that, because it was originally, remember, there were two nuclei in the central cell, and when the sperm deposits the third nuclei, we now have a triploid cell. So that is referred to as triploid, and that is unique to the angiosperms. In the gymnosperms, the endosperm is haploid. In the angiosperms, the endosperm is triploid. Then what happens is the fruit begins to form as the ovary thickens. So over here, let's write that the ovary eventually becomes the fruit. So the ovary will thicken, and in the case of the cherry tree, will form a sweet outer covering around the seed that we call a fleshy fruit, and is sweet. And it's sweet so that it can attract animals to eat the fruit and to aid in seed dispersal. Let's watch that process again of double fertilization in this animation.
The function of flowering is to produce seeds and disperse them to locations where the young plants are likely to survive. At each step, there is an emphasis on protecting the offspring. This activity reviews some of the most important steps. Events in seed formation begin with pollination, in which wind or animals bring pollen to the flower. The growth of pollen tubes causes the flower to discard its colorful parts, petals and stamen. After pollen arrives, the bright petals are a hazard. They attract animals that might eat the delicate young fruit. We've enlarged the ovary and sliced it open. An ovary contains one or more ovules that will become seeds if they are fertilized. One ovule is shown here, with the front removed to reveal its parts. The ovule is attached to the ovary wall by a stalk that provides nutrients. Starting from a pollen grain at the stigma, which is not shown, a pollen tube grows down through the carpel to the ovule. It carries two sperm that enter the ovule. One sperm fuses with the egg cell to make a zygote, which is the first cell of the embryo. The other sperm fuses with the two nuclei in the central cell, making a triploid nucleus. The triploid cell will grow and divide to make a food-storing tissue, the endosperm.
Okay, so what is left at the end of double fertilization? Well, we have one or more seeds inside of the ovary, Okay, so we are inside, these would be seeds, form inside the ovary, which will become the fruit. And then that seed, remember, has three parts. The seed coat, which is diploid, the sporophyte, embryo, which is also diploid, and resulted from here the zygote being fertilized. The zygote was an egg that joined with a sperm nuclei and formed the zygote. And then the remainder, the internal part, is endosperm. And what's the ploidy on the endosperm? That's right, triploid. So that's unique to the angiosperms. And we call that process because there's two sperm. Remember, there's two sperm that enter the pollen tube. We call that process double fertilization. Unique to angiosperms. Okay? At this point, I would like to the very last time, show you this diagram of the alternation of generations life cycle of plants. So we've learned about 4 different groups of plants. We've learned about the bryophytes, also known as the non-vascular plants. We've learned about the seedless vascular plants, like ferns. We learned about gymnosperms, like pine trees. And we learned about angiosperms, the flowering, fruiting plants. So these are the 4 major groups. You need to know what the sporophyte and the gametophyte structures look like. So I like this diagram because it summarizes what we've learned from that. So remember, bryophytes, like mosses, those are the sprouts of sporophytes with little capsules on the end that make the spores. In ferns, remember, it's the fern frond that is the sporophyte with the sori structures on the underside of the leaves, full of sporangia that make the spores. In gymnosperms, we consider the entire pine tree, including the cones, the male and the female cones, to be the sporophyte. In the angiosperms, we consider the entire plant, including the flowers, to be the sporophytes. Now let's look at the gametophytes. The gametophytes of mosses are the dominant structure. It's the only one of the 4 groups that has gametophyte dominant structures. So in bryophytes, in mosses, remember, it's the green structures that we can see with the naked eye and represent the largest body form of this particular plant. In the ferns, remember, the gametophyte is this heart-shaped structure that has both the male and the female gametophytes on the same structure. Same thing with the bryophytes, by the way, right? So the bryophytes have the male and the female gametophytes on the same part of the plant. In the gymnosperms, the male gametophyte is pollen, and that pollen travels by wind. So it gets released from the male cones. In the gymnosperm, the female gametophyte is referred to as the ovule sac. and produces the eggs. In the angiosperms, very similar, looks a little bit different, but the pollen, again, is the male gametophyte, and the ovule sac is the female gametophyte, both of which are microscopic. Very, very small. Lastly, I want to tell you about the corpse flower. So I want you to make sure you understand in the angiosperms the importance of pollinators. And these pollinators are very particularly adapted to their flowers that they facilitate pollinating, but also the flower itself is very well adapted to attract a specific pollinator. So most flowers smell very sweet and they're colorful, and this is all meant to attract their pollinators. That is the purpose of the petals, is to be um, to be the attractor for the insect or the bird pollinator. That is their job. So what about the corpse flower? When I was a student at UC Davis, the the botanical garden we had at UC Davis has a corpse flower, and it only blooms about once a year. And when it only blooms for about 24 hours. And so um, when you smell this flower, it does in fact smell awful, like rotting flesh. Why is that? Well, it's to attract its pollinator. And who's the pollinator of the corpse flower? Who would be attracted to rotting flesh? In fact, look at the leaves. These are actually modified leaves here that are red or sort of purplish red. And then this structure here is actually, it actually heats up to body temperature so that it is very closely mimicking a dead animal body to attract a pollinator that would be interested in a dead animal body, which would be, dun da da, black flies. So the black flies, they go deep down into the flower where we actually find the female structures, and they hopefully pick up some of the pollen from another corpse flower and then deposit it onto um, the female parts of this corpse flower and facilitate the pollination process. So that gives you an idea of one example of a type of relationship we refer to in nature as symbiosis. So where the pollinator benefits, usually from getting some sort of food source like the nectar from the stigma that pollinator eats. And then the flower benefits because it uses the insect to transmit its pollen to another plant. Remember, all plants can self-fertilize, meaning they can transfer their own pollen to their own female structures, but in order to ensure genetic diversity, the pollen would need to be transmitted to a completely different flower of the same species. Anyways, that is our discussion on plants this week, and I hope that was interesting. I will talk to you next time.